welcome to another episode of the Coding with AI podcast, where we have conversations with humans who build apps with AI. You know, when the screen is dark, I'm actually dancing to that music because it really makes me happy. I don't know about you guys. I hope that happens to you as well. Anyway, I'm Marcelo Lewin, your host and the founder of iCode with AI. If you want to get a hold of me, as always, just email me, marcelo at icodewith.ai. Now, in today's episode, I'm chatting with Josh Thornes. He's the director of AI and software engineering at E360. Really cool guy. You're going to learn a lot from him. And today we're talking about probably one of the most confusing things when it comes to the vibe coding community, which is deploying your app. Coding it, planning it. Now, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's easier than deploying it because we still need some help on that deploying part. So we're going to talk a lot about deployment and options available. But before we get started, remember to subscribe to the YouTube channel, click that bell icon to get notified when a new episode is out. And if you enjoyed this episode, go ahead and hit the like button. If you didn't, send me an email and tell me why. All right, without further ado, let's get started. Josh, welcome.
Hey Marcelo, thanks for having me, bud.
Glad to have you here. Actually, we have a meetup that we host at Josh's place, E360, and that's where I met him, and we chatted a lot. He's working on some really cool projects, which we're gonna save that for another conversation. But today we're talking about deployment, which you know quite a bit about. Before we do that, why don't you give just a quick overview of your background? How did you get into development, your position in AI and vibe coding?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, bud. You know, um, Throughout my whole life, I've really enjoyed sports, and so for me, computers was not, natural. But my friend gave me a JavaScript book back in the early 2000s, and I couldn't stop reading it. And from there, I've loved reading and learning about development and technology, and just fascinated with the creative, plus all of the organizational parts of it. And so throughout my career, I've been, doing development for applications, data and analytics. I spent a while at Wells Fargo in the innovation lab and in the data analytics space. And then recently was at AWS in ProServe to help out with, application modernization. And now at E360, I get to do a lot with um, like today's topic, AI, whether it's for development or to change how we operate in businesses.
Yeah, and you're obviously director of AI, so you're working on a lot of AI projects. But what's your favorite language or coding that you did or that you do?
It's probably still JavaScript, to be honest with you. I kind
Mm-hmm.
of spent a lot of years in C sharp. I love JavaScript and Python. There's always new languages coming out or new libraries that are a lot of fun. So kind of that C type of syntax, from like C sharp and Python, and also JavaScript. So TypeScript and Python or TypeScript and JavaScript are probably my favorites right now.
Okay, all right. Do you have a framework that you work with that you like in general, or
Yeah,
just plain old JavaScript?
there's always new frameworks. I'm always keeping a pulse on, like what trends are saying as far as like new frameworks and stuff like that. For Python, probably it would be LangChain, or Strands is another fun, cool one coming out. For TypeScript, JavaScript, I love React and just kind of the lightweight, kind of like quickly organize things. We talked before in our last meetup about kind of like dry principles.
Yeah.
Don't repeat yourself. And so I love being able to create little components inside of React and be able to like quickly organize things. And so the latest one is Next.js and the AI SDK. So that is a lot of fun, and some of the new UI elements that they're starting to produce that naturally just fits into some of these cool AI applications. And a little concept. I don't know if you've heard of this before, but like I don't know how I exactly feel about it just yet, but AI is the new UI. Kind of interesting concept, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, it just means kind of like, and maybe you want to weigh in, but I kind of just look at it as we're reimagining how we connect systems and maybe how we interact with them.
I agree. I mean, chat, it's an interim step. I think it's going to evolve a bit more, but definitely conversation is the natural form. Clicking is not the natural form. When we meet people, we don't click their nose or their face, right? We're talking to them. So I think the reason ChatGPT took off so quickly is because of that conversational network format, right? That you can just have the conversation, it speaks back to you, and you get what you want. So I do agree that AI is the new UX. Yeah, totally, completely.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's talk about deployment. Let's define deployment. Tell me, what do we mean by deploying, publishing your app?
For deployment for me is, like several years ago for iOS, I got into like kind of building out my own iOS application. I'd never built, Objective-C. It was kind of fun. I spent 2 weeks building my first application, and then I spent 2 weeks trying to deploy my application. And so like it's always been an issue, but like in our last meetup that you kind of brought up, I really liked you had a bunch of different categories, like I think some of them were like reputational risk or user base or, complexity, and kind of like taking all those things into consideration, I think is factors into kind of like how you build things. And so to me, that I love the building part of it. And sometimes it gets a little bit challenging when you try to deploy. And so I'm hoping that, with today's topic, we can shed a little bit of light on, getting your application published, whether it's a web application or, like a little function, an MCP, or even, like an iOS application or website. So all of those categories, I'm hoping that we can kind of touch on a little bit today.
Yeah, and we are. So let's. Why don't we start with the mental shift that a Vive coder needs to go through? They're done with their MVP, their prototype. They want to move this to production now. So where is that mental shift? What is it that they need to think about? What's that checklist they have to go through from your perspective?
It's totally different. The build process is a lot of fun. Typically, you get to like, either through, natural language like you're talking about, or, through code, you're able to kind of build something really cool. But then it is a little bit of a shift when you go into and look at, the deployment process, because of the fact that when you're deploying, there's a lot of logical steps, and you have to worry about, scale, or who's my audience, or do I need to worry about, people in, South America, as far as deploying it out to them. So kind of like locale can, kind of be critical. And so to me, the deployment process is a total different shift right now, and hopefully in the future that maybe changes. And definitely with some of the emerging, services, that does, kind of like help out. But with the deployments, you have to kind of start with the end in mind. And so what that means to me is, sometimes you're, kind of build something really great, and maybe you have to refactor it because of the fact that when you're building, it's, very, creative, and you're like, hey, you know what? I know exactly what I want to do. When it comes to deployment, you have to start thinking about scale and observability and like all these different things. Cost is another thing. You have to worry about all these different things when it comes to actually the deployment process, which is a different mindset. It goes from very logical, uh, um, from the creative part before, to very logical and, kind of like organization. Sometimes you kind of like regret some of the decisions that you might have made while kind of like in the, kind of the build phase, whether it's, kind of like AI assisted or vibe coded. You kind of regret maybe some of the decisions because you might get cornered in. And so you kind of need to be kind of like aware of some of that, and maybe even be ready to potentially, like refactor. I like refactoring because I always feel like I do it better the second time, or maybe the third. But you kind of have to be aware of, some of that challenge as you're going into the deployment phase.
Now, you mentioned observability. Let's define that. What do you mean by that? Because that's something you're not doing generally when you're just coding locally. So let's talk through that and tell us what do you mean by that? What tools are can people use? Things like that.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of times in the systems that you're deploying to will have observability. And what that means is you're observing the things that are happening within your system. You're able to troubleshoot. So if someone gets a weird outcome, you can see that that thing happened. Hopefully it was logged to some sort of log. And so like for at a minimum during your, let's just say hypothetically you deploy something, and for the first, maybe weeks or months, you have a lot of logging that's happening. You're seeing the interactions, you're seeing the errors. Sometimes just trapping the errors isn't, enough. And so, kind of like observing a lot of the things, the interactions that are happening, or even observability can be, like your user base, kind of like what you've seen from Google Analytics, seeing like where people are coming from, what platform. Maybe you built something that was a website, but you didn't account for your user base of like or mobile users, and you're getting a lot of mobile users. And so just kind of observing all those different things that are happening within your users can help you to troubleshoot. You always try to test things, and we'll probably talk about testing later. You always try to test for like all these different scenarios before you actually deploy. But observability will kind of help you out for those things that you might not have tested for or trapped for unknown circumstances.
So edge cases. Let's talk about
Yeah.
testing a little bit, right? Because I think in testing in this scenario, more like performance testing and scalability testing. How do you go through that? I had a whole podcast with the technical manager at Microsoft for Playwright. So we spoke about unit testing, all of that stuff, but we didn't really touch upon scalability testing and making sure that the app doesn't go down. Because one thing is to code a little game for you that you're going to play, and that's it. And another thing is to launch it to a million people, right? So, how do you go through that process, or what's your mental thinking through that process?
Yeah, so let me just touch on a few different types of testing real quick. So unit testing is typically something that you would do kind of local, and kind of test out different scenarios. And usually you're always trying to bring some of those performance or load testing or functional testing back into your unit testing. So you're testing it before it gets out to your user base. Functional testing is kind of like where you're testing for, different operations, with the users. And again, you try to bring that as close as you can before you're doing the deployment. So any scenarios you try to, kind of test for beforehand. What's great about, and I think you even saw in your framework that you have, Marcelo, is that um, there's ways of generating these tests, and kind of like through natural language generate certain tests or certain scenarios. And then like one of the things that I've seen oftentimes for like load testing is that you're bringing up is typically it's kind of like abstracted away from the user, and like kind of more so unit tests. It's actually doing some of the operations on the user. So like on let's just say a website, it's going through and actually clicking a lot of those different things. Or it might be like, hey, I just built out this really cool MCP server or this really cool function that can integrate into all these different systems. With load tests, you would go through and emulate some of those users' tests and look for how it responds to load. And this is where observability also comes in, is because you can actually look for, some of those different areas that might be slow, and troubleshoot some of those, and then maybe bring that back into like a unit test, so that way in the future it gets tested beforehand, so you can trap for it before, and then you might be able to tune that little section. But like again, back to deployment, like all of these things kind of go into like away from the creative space and into kind of like the architecture space,
Right.
where you might worry about caching or whatever that you didn't worry about before.
Well, let's talk. Let's touch a little bit upon what you said about having simulated users. It sounds like that's the perfect place where AI can take over and do that part. Are there tools for that specifically for vibe coders that can, or even developers that they can use to do simulated 1,000 users, 500,000 users, or anything like that?
It kind of varies by what framework you're using or what application you're building.
Right.
um, some of the things that I really like seeing coming out of the industry right now, specifically in kind of vibe coding and then even agentic coding, is that there's like these hook frameworks.
Right.
With hooks, like these action hooks, what happens is upon check-in or like into your code repository, or like whenever you kind of like do this certain action from when you're like, doing your vibe coding, either one of those different things can invoke an action. And so if you're using like, for instance, Cloud Code or Kiro or other, kind of vibe coding tools, there's this idea of a hook that can invoke some of these like users
Hmm.
to do, performance or unit testing. And so that's kind of where I would lean as far as looking at, kind of naturally where you're at, whether it's, Cursor or Claude or wherever you're at, look to see what they have as far as hooks to invoke some of these agents to run.
Now you can
Uh,
also use the hooks for observability, right? To see what
yeah,
happens as soon as, right.
yeah. I would say in addition to that, outside of the context of what's normal and maybe, getting a little bit into like, kind of where we're going with this topic, you know, wherever you can, you try to add automation.
Right.
And so, like, as you're going through your deployments, there's also hooks that you can do too on your deployments to run some of these certain actions to do your tests. So that way, you're not just relying on, like your local machine to do tests. You can actually kind of farm some of this out to do load, unit, or functional testing within your deployment process. So, like, if you're deploying to a large user base, you might want to kind of farm some of that out to have, some of that load or unit testing happening.
Well, and this is more of the CI/CD pipeline,
Yeah.
right? Which I know we're getting into. So we're getting more closer to the realm of AI assisted engineering versus vibe coding, right? And but that also, and some people that may be watching may be a bit disappointing. Oh, like I just want a button that just puts it all out there. There is a reality today that we have to live with. Maybe we'll get to that point, right? But today, I think the deployment part, there's no Claude code for deployment yet, or is there that you know of?
For deployments, like the best thing that I kind of have found right now is just leaning into automation. And that's why I apologize, getting a little bit technical here,
No,
but
no,
like
no, not at
I,
all. I mean, it's a reality.
I, it is a reality for the deployment phase, unfortunately. And the best thing that I kind of have found is, leaning into, kind of like, deploying your infrastructure, your, kind of services, through code. And that code can be generated, through, like our VibeBox, type framework, or
Hmm.
it can be generated, just through like using a coding assistant. And so I've used that a lot. I think it's a great way to at least create all your scaffolding of what your deployment should look like. But I like to use things that have like, workflows or actions in them. So, like for instance, whether it's ServiceNow or, Jira or GitHub Actions, like any one of those things, or even, kind of like Vercel, like V0, like all of those things have these like little deployments that you can do where you can add automation into them. And this is, unfortunately, you do have to kind of start with some of this as far as like, uh, at least kind of consider where you're going and like look into like what does my build look like and what is my deployment going to look like also.
Yeah, it does require deployment requires some architecting, right? Thinking through the
Yeah.
entire process, that pipeline that we're talking about, and thinking through that process. So let's address the people that, for example, let's say the people that are unlovable, right? And they can just deploy by pressing a publish. They can publish on Lovable, right? And it's now live. What? And I'm not saying you shouldn't do that because there are many apps that are running on Lovable. So definitely not putting that down at all.
Mhm.
Um, what are your thoughts on that for a scalable solution for people that are wanting that kind of ease? But to scale is like a Lovable or a similar or like a Replit. Is that a perfectly valid place to publish an app from an enterprise perspective? Let's say, like you deal with a lot of customers, or are you going to have to really extract the code from there, which many let you, and go through this CI/CD pipeline?
I think it kind of varies based on your criteria that we brought up at the last meetup, which is like what does your user base look like, how many users you're
Risk
going to have,
risk
what's your
impact. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And oftentimes I think that like I don't, this is my opinion, but I don't think that you could necessarily build like an Amazon.com on there. But does
Right.
that mean that it's a bad tool? No, I think it's great. Just like, WordPress or some of these other, great tools, and so, or Wix, like I think there's some really cool things that you can do with it in a very short amount of time. But like there are things that you're going to need to consider, like hypothetically, do you have to worry about deploying it to other parts of, the US or other parts of the world? Do you need to connect it into a database? Do you need to worry about, adding authentication? Do you need to worry about, integrating it to other systems? When you start bringing all those things into account, like that might adjust the different tools that you're going to need to leverage. You know, um, Internal, we have a few people using Lovable, which is great, and it has a nice kind of like backend database server to it, Supabase, and but like as you start integrating that into your system, you have to kind of look at does this match kind of some of our architecture? Do we like how it do we like the pricing model? Do we like how it integrates into the things that we're already doing, and who's going to manage this system? So all those things
Well,
are consideration. Go ahead.
yeah, and the pricing model that you mentioned is actually extremely important because you may have a fixed pricing model that limits the bandwidth or the hits you're going to get or the number of database calls or whatever it may be. And you may have an on-demand pricing model that you go broke. You may get a surge of people coming in, but you're a free website like iCode with AI, right? I'm not monetizing that. I want to have a lot of people, and luckily right now it's all being hosted on GitHub Pages, which we're going to talk about actually, because even though it's simple, there's still kind of technical. You have to do some technical stuff. But I think you should expand a little more on the pricing model and talk about the different pricing models when deploying, because I think that is really important, especially if your app is using AI, right, in the back end as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and like with Lovable, great platform, but you're going to be charged for whenever you're actually like vibe coding. And so like hypothetically, you're like, hey, can you add this button over to this page? Or can you change the menu system? Or can you update, the colors? Each one of those inferences, each one of that kind of those discussions, that conversation is going to cost money. And then it's going to also cost money then also to like, for instance, host each month. Not a bad thing, but I actually really like what you brought up here recently, Marcelo, which is like when we're going through and like, for instance, like doing a lot of the planning locally, that's like a great way to like save money. And so, like hypothetically, if you're in the system and you're writing all this code and you're doing all of that, or not writing code, you're kind of like having a conversation with AI and it's writing the code for you, that can get really costly because you're chatting back and forth, and each one of those turns in the conversation costs money. And so I like what you brought up here recently, which was actually if you do a lot of that discussion like in a different system and you kind of plan out ahead of time, um, and then you actually then send all that discussion into like a single commit, that's a great way to save money. And so like that you can save money on the conversations and then also on the hosting.
Yeah, definitely. Well, what about from the actual hosting perspective? What's the typical pricing model out there that people should be on the lookout for? I mean, what are people charged for, right? Like in I'm hosting on Vercel, right? And you can get the pro
Yeah.
version, which is a monthly, but you're going to be limited on bandwidth. You're going to be limited on the number of calls you can do to functions, so on and so forth. So, what is a checklist that people should look out for and get prepared if they do, go viral with their app?
Yeah, I think scalability is also like always, something that you want to look at, and return on investment, right? So like hopefully the things that you're producing is returning that return on investment for you. And so like for instance, like I like to have, frameworks that are going to scale as my user base scales, but then also hopefully your, the income is increasing to help offset that. And so like, I would just kind of like start with, a smaller, hypothetically, if you're building something yourself as a hobbyist, hopefully you're starting with a smaller budget and then allows you to kind of grow from there. If you're starting, like as a small to medium sized business, hopefully you kind of start with like at least a little bit of redundancy, and you kind of plan for where you want to deploy within, like, let's just say the country that you're in, and then expand your countries from there. And so like hobbyist, I'd probably look at, under, $50, to start out with, per month. Hopefully you can stay, maybe $10 to $30. For businesses, I'd plan for at least, $100 to $200 for a small to medium business. For enterprise, much more than that. But
Right.
hopefully you're kind of like, you have like this little slider that says, hey, we're going to ramp up as the users, ramping up, and you can keep a pulse on the active user count, like how many users are kind of like always there. And then from there, you kind of can scale your solution from that. But hopefully, as you scale, you're not having to worry about the solution or the platform that you chose. You're not having to worry about as you scale, like how do I deploy this to a second server? The servers or the solution should be dynamic to be able to scale with you.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So let's talk about now, like for example, for my website, I code with AI and some other apps. I'm hosting the actual code on. I keep the source code on GitHub, but then I deploy it to through Actions. I deploy it to Vercel, but I may have functions that remote functions that I'm calling that I'm hosting on, let's say, Netlify. So deployment sometimes isn't a like you're just going to one place. It may be multiple, right? You may have an AWS bucket that you got to deploy that to, right? Or a function in AWS. So do you have some guidelines as to there's tons of these hosting platforms. Do you have a preference? Not because nobody here is getting paid by this by anybody yet. Hopefully one day, but not yet. But do you have like? Do you think Vercel is the way to go versus Netlify, AWS, and which? I mean, you used to work for AWS, so you're probably going to say AWS. But which do you recommend for vibe coders to at least start with?
So I do love AWS and I do love actually Azure. I worked with them for a long time
Oh,
also.
okay.
I usually say actually I like to have people kind of like congregate their data together. So if your database is in a certain area, you should probably look at having your application there also. And so I try to meet people where they're at. And so like I think that Vercel is a great platform to deploy on, just like Lovable. But just understand some of the limitations. I have this little acronym that I like to do, which is elegant, maintainable, and simple. And what that means to me is, I talked about refactoring before, and I do love to refactor because it helps things to be like dry. So I'm reducing the amount of like duplicate components or duplicate functions, or I'm building a backend data store, a database for, maybe one or many applications. And so like I like to have like a service that can kind of grow with my business needs. And so like I would typically never like say, hey, let's deploy this thing over in Google, and then I'm also going to deploy this thing over here in Vercel, and I'll have this thing over in Lovable also. Usually I like to have those things like simplified. I found that as you have things simplified, you can actually like scale them very quickly. And the messier your house is, or messier your code base is, the more issues you'll have as far as like maintainability. And I would just encourage you guys to make sure that you are keeping things organized. And I know we kind of talked about this a little bit before, but that's the fun part of coding, in my opinion, which is that it's a little bit of, hey, look how cool this thing is. It has this really nice gradient. But then you're also like, hey, look how cool this database is that I just built
Right.
that interacts with it. And so I think all of that organization matters.
Well, and okay, so and this is where you can't separate deployment from planning at the beginning of
Yeah.
your app, right? Because if you plan things well, then you can scale well. And that's what scalability means, where I think a lot of people, especially vibe coders, which are not traditional developers that are coming from a marketing organization or they're a product manager or they're coming into this, they the scaling an app means being able to plan it and design it in a way that you can literally take pieces and go, oh, this piece needs to scale a bit more than this piece because it's handling a lot more. And you can only do that if you plan it right, if you create your database in a good normalized way, right? If you have your functions. And also one thing you touched upon, which I think is we actually skipped over, but I think it's very important, is scaling to the world, not just locally to the US or to your state or to your city. But if you're publishing an app, you may be going to the entire world. And if that app is a SaaS app, right, that accesses content on a CMS or a database, you want to be locally to their place, which means caching and replicating, right? So I think we
Yep,
should
definitely.
expand a little bit more about that because I know AWS is obviously very big on that. They have regions and all that, but can you explain a little bit about that and how does that change the mindset of a vibe coder that is just in front of the computer with a prompt to think about that prompt and to think that this prompt, which will be an app, may be in multiple regions around the world later.
One technique that I really love is, kind of like I love the creative part of it, to be honest with you. But oftentimes what I try to abstract away is, a lot of like the deployment process, unfortunately. And that's why I wanted to talk about this topic is because like one of the techniques I really love is containers. And it's basically like, and we're starting to see more of this come out, like for instance, like AWS Agent Core or Vercel or Netlify where it's these combined application hosting frameworks. And that's kind of what containers it has been and already is. And so that's one of the things I really like to lean in on is, hypothetically, if you're building like a little React app and you pull in this one library, it can oftentimes help you out with adding a function that might need to be like a service hosted from, somewhere else. Like let's just say a caching service, for instance. You can just easily mix these things together, put it all in a container, and then that container can be hosted, on someone's, phone. It can be hosted on a machine, or it could be hosted, like in Vercel or in AWS or Azure. It kind of removes away from the actual deployment process. And so where you can, I try to use, containers. And so that way it kind of like I can deploy it anywhere and not really have to be stuck into or cornered into like the hosting platform and like all its nuances. And so I really lean into like, open source things and how I can, kind of mix those things together. So like for instance, you brought up the example of, Lovable. It integrates into Supabase, really nicely. Well, like what happens if you need to, add a weird authentication provider, which authentication is, something that most all applications have to worry about.
Right.
And it is very technical. There's no
Right.
way around getting around the authentication and the authorization stuff. You get into like more so like the systems and integration stuff at that point. And so when you leverage a framework, like Lovable, and then you mix in something that's like an authentication provider framework, like Next Auth, it allows you to quickly integrate these things, and you don't have to worry about it. And so I always look for little recipes that help me to build. Again, back to the kind of the EMS thing, that elegant, maintainable, and simple.
Yeah, I like that. That's actually really cool. You'll have to email me this so I put it on the with the podcast text because people really need to remember that. Yeah, I mean that totally makes sense. Now, one big issue that I think a lot of people aren't talking about, and I'm going to have a podcast guest actually focusing on this, but I want to get your take on is when you're deploying to its security concerns. I'm going to bring up, and I know you know about this app issue, the T app that was created, and then hackers broke into it and stole, I think, millions of IDs of women that they uploaded to verify themselves. And it was a vibe coded app. And of course, everybody jumped and said, see, this is why AI is not good. This is why the media, or this is why vibe coding is horrible. But the reality was, it was, well, the product owner obviously didn't assess the risk factors of their app and said, let's bring a human security person that really knows this and make sure that this is correct. That's not an issue with AI. That's a human issue, in my opinion. Um, but what are some security considerations before, and we spoke about, look, first of all, figure out the risk factor, right? If your app is risky, if you have some personal information that you're storing from people, you're going to need to put a lot of security. But for a vibe coder, or let's be honest, even a developer, I mean, may not know this stuff, right? Because a developer is not a security specialist. What are some things that checklists that they should go through? They could probably even use AI to help them go through that checklist. But what are some checklists that they should go through and make sure that it passes with AI or get a human in the loop?
That's a great bring up there, Marcelo. I totally agree with you on the, leveraging AI to kind of help you to guide you through some of the different risks. Some of these platforms do have like little checks that you can put in place, like little these things called linting, which kind of like goes through and makes sure that you're not doing certain things, which I think is always a great thing to put in place, along with your, testing frameworks and stuff. One of the things I really love to do is like as I'm coding, oftentimes I'll have my assistant up, my little coding assistant, and I'll be asking it questions, like things to consider. And so I really like where you're going there as far as like just it's there as a companion. We used to say all the time in the industry, "Hey, let's go out and Google that," right? But what that had to do was you had to go through and enumerate all these different sites and say, "Okay, well, what's the opinion of all of them?" Whereas your coding assistant can just go out and bring you all those concerns. I think one important thing is you always should think about with your application, like what is, obviously you brought up your user base, but what's the worst thing that you can think of? And I'm not that kind of person. I don't think of like how to hack a website or how to like, get around, like an agent, AI agent and like escape out of its guardrails. And so like we can't always think of those things. And so like you have to kind of like leverage, some of these frameworks that are out there to kind of like test and like validate some of the things you're doing. And so I would start with, at a bare minimum, your database, your data store, should be encrypted. As you're doing your deployments, all of your secrets should be secured. And that should be secured by environment. And so, like, for instance, like, let's just say that it's just you. Um, you should trust yourself. You can secure those things. But if you have like maybe, one or two people, maybe those people shouldn't be able to see some of those different secrets. And so you're doing like least privileged access. So anytime you're doing your deployments, you're escaping away your secrets. You're doing, rotations to your secrets as far as like to your database, to your code base. You're abstracting all of those things away from like only the people that really need to have access to those things. And so I think assume that people are not going to be doing the right things, and then remove your secrets and access to your database or data stores or integrations, your API keys, all of those things. Remove as much of those things away from like like um, embedded into your code. You do not want to have that embedded into anything that gets deployed or into your repository. And I would definitely encourage all of you guys. I don't do anything without having a repository. So like, regardless if it's Lovable or WordPress or whatever, make sure and take a backup of your code. Like the last thing that you want to do is, like, hey, you know what? Can you do this, one thing where I'm, kind of like, changing the menu on this page, and then all of a sudden, like, it wipes out your whole menu, plus it, does something weird to your database. Like, if you took a backup of it and you're checking it in frequently, you don't worry. You're like, okay, perfect. Whenever I'm doing like changes, I'm always like quickly, checking things in and commenting, so that way I know exactly what changed. So that way I can review it and assume that it. I don't know about you guys, but when I'm using ChatGPT, I think it's awesome. But sometimes it comes back with like the wrong answer. The same thing is going to be true in your code base, and assume that thing that is changing, you want to see exactly what was changed.
Yeah, and I think that's where the risk factors come in, right? Do a risk impact, have AI help you do a risk impact and figure
Yeah.
out. What happens if this piece of data goes out to the public? Nothing, no big deal, nobody gets harmed, good to go, don't worry about it. Try to be as good as possible security wise. But can people get harmed? Can women be harassed because of this TAP thing, right? Then you definitely want to start with AI. I wouldn't end with AI. I would always the as you go up the risk factor, I bring in humans that are specialized that specialize in security, because the outcome of it is, yeah, you can save some money now up front, but you're going to get sued later.
I think it's a great point. In many of our solutions that we're building, AI is assisting us, but we always have
Right.
this thing that's called human in the loop. And so
Exactly.
it's going through and reviewing. AI is assisting in the review process. It's assisting in, kind of like the build process. But people are reviewing it, especially, like when you're going to production and stuff. So.
Right. Yeah. I always recommend, even vibe coders are recommend, look at the code. You may not understand it, but you may catch something. Don't always just blindly accept, which I know goes against that vibing with AI. But I think vibe coding is definitely morphing into sort of an in between the full vibe coding and full systems engineering. You mentioned using code to write infrastructure before a while ago. Explain a little bit what you meant by that, right? And then, do you think AI is ready today to be able to do that, or is it too risky to let AI touch your infrastructure code?
We're already doing it now. So,
Okay.
like, we use like Terraform for pretty much everything, and or Bicep, or like whatever the cloud provider is. Typically, we try to standardize on Terraform, but infrastructure as code is like, for instance, let's just say you're going to Vercel, or you're going to AWS, or Azure, or Google, any one of these cloud platforms. Typically there's some sort of configuration. And this is kind of like, the more kind of like cloud-based you get, the more you have to worry about that. That's why I was kind of mentioning before, the use of containers. Containers, get a lot easier as far as like how you're, kind of deploying things. But the more cloud-based you get, the more, like, for instance, let's just say hypothetically we're on Vercel and we're using Supabase and we're also using ServiceNow, and maybe Jira is in there somewhere. Like, all of those things have to get deployed. And typically what we'd like to do is, what I would recommend is you have more than one environment. Hopefully you guys are already doing that now. And I think that the more environments matter, the larger your organization is. And so, like, let's just say that you're a small business or you're a hobbyist, maybe you can get away with two environments, like a development and a production. And as you go into like larger organizations, you might have seven environments. Regardless of that, you don't want to be going through and clicking each one of those different configurations and like, oh man, I forgot to do this one checkbox over here. You want to try to repeat that process, just like, like with Vibe Docs, it's going through and you're creating a process and you're going through and setting things up. There's instructions. And so what's great is if you leverage infrastructure as code, it's going through and configuring all of your environments. Those environments are then getting built out. They're getting built out from your deployment processes. And so basically, it's a list of instructions, usually in a JSON format or like a YAML format. I prefer YAML. YAML format's very kind of like, I like bulleted lists, so go figure. But those bulleted lists go
And vibe
through
coders
and,
should be familiar with that because vibe coding, a lot
yeah,
of it is either going to be markdown or YAML.
yeah, definitely. And so it'll go through and give you instructions on how things should get laid out. You should have variable placeholders on your environment variables that are specific to and removing like API keys or database passwords and stuff like that. All of that infrastructure will get built out and then deployed for you. And so oftentimes what we're seeing is that, through like the first kind of like initial setup, usually what I'll do is I'll ask, my coding assistant, like, oh, hey, I got this web application and I want to deploy it to Vercel. What should I consider as far as my deployment? And it'll give me a list of things to consider. And then from there, I'll say, okay, perfect. Can you help me create a deployment file for that? And I'll go through and kind of scaffold out that deployment. maybe there's a few tweaks. You go into the UI and you say, hey, you know what? I need to worry about this, integration or this function, or what is caching? Do I care about that? And so I'll go through and confirm all that configuration with what was initially built, make sure that I have my variables filled out as far as my secret API keys or whatever, and abstract those out by environment. So we talked about like a dev and production environment. Those are going to vary, hopefully. You should always have them vary. And you would extract those out from the infrastructure, and they would get substituted as you go through your deployment.
Right. And they're going to vary because you're going to have like a dev database versus you're not going to be coding and testing against inserting test data into your production database. Hopefully not. You're not going to be doing this.
Yes, exactly.
Um, yeah, definitely. Well, we touched upon a bunch of stuff. We were like at the 45-minute mark, so we're pretty much done. Josh, I want to thank you. I also want to, I hate these titles of podcasts where people think that it's going to be in 5 minutes, I build the next Facebook and it scaled to a billion people. That's a lie. That doesn't happen. It's not going to happen anytime soon. And as we found out today, deploying an app, truly deploying a professional app that'll scale, it's maintainable, can be used by millions of people, will require still some technical ability. And it seems that the number one tip for vibe coders that aren't super technical is you're going to need to learn at a minimum, learn enough about all these kinds of technologies and how they interact with each other to be able to guide the AI to help you implement them.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Final thoughts, final words from you about anything you like, future of vibe coding, future of AI encoding, future of infrastructure as code with AI, whatever you like to close it up with.
Yeah, I think this is a really exciting space. Hopefully, hopefully you guys see my passion for, building. Hopefully, none of this that talked about today limits you from, building. Like I talked a little about my background in sports, and we had a mom at the last meetup, and we had a, pharmacist and a photographer, and we had, engineers, and hopefully you hear more so that this is an exciting time to build. The deployment stuff, you're going to figure it out. We have these awesome coding assistants. You don't need to Google it anymore. They can help you out with, getting your deployments done. You can build it. Your ideas, matter. And I'm excited to see what you guys are going to build because, everyone's, creative ideas should get, kind of like built and reimagined, leveraging some of these awesome AI tools to get built. But AI integrated into your applications is even more exciting. So I can't wait to see some of the things that you guys build and share with us at some of the meetups in the future.
That's a beautiful way to close it up in a super positive note. I love it, and I 100% agree with you on that. Build, build, build. It's easier than ever, and if it makes you feel good and you built something you like, go for it. And if you can't figure out how to deploy it, you can hire a person, a real human, to come along and help you out. But definitely go out and build. So, Josh, thank you so much. If people want to get a hold of you, best way is.
Yeah, LinkedIn, I would say, or josh.e360 or josh.thornes@e360.com. LinkedIn is probably usually always the best way because everyone can find each other on there. So
Yeah, and then I've got the link for LinkedIn on the website, the landing page for this podcast, which will be available by tomorrow on demand as well. Josh, thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you. You're actually going to be presenting on the next meetup, the Coding with AI meetup. You can be presenting on this very topic, but you're going to actually have a presentation and a workshop, so it's going to be lots of fun. Look forward to seeing you there. If you are out there, are anywhere near Irvine, California, you got to join us over there at E360. Josh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
thanks for having me.
And thanks to the rest of you. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. It was a lot of fun. Again, deploying an app right now, it requires a little bit more work than just coding it, but you'll be able to do it with AI's help, with our help, with iCode with .ai's help. We will get you through it. So please go at it and do it. As always, if you want to get a hold of me for any reason, just email me, Marcelo at icodewith.ai. I'd love to hear from you. Next episode, I'm going to have a developer to talk about vibe coding. He's been vibe coding quite a bit, and he's going to talk about it from a developer's point of view. How is this going to be affecting developers? And it's all good stuff. So don't be scared. Make sure you attend. Also, if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Click the bell icon to get notified when a new episode is out. And if you enjoyed this episode, hit the like button. If you didn't, send me an email and tell me why. So until the next episode, cheers, everybody.